get them involved too. Well, anyway, I think it's high time we got started. So hello, welcome to tonight's discussion. My name is Sean. Myself and Sarah are co-leads for the Policy Nerd Nights team. We're a newly formed coalition of policy nerds who organize monthly panel discussions and educational webinars on all things US policy. We've been going for several months now. The Policy Nerd Nights is an ongoing series hosted by Level Up California. Level Up California, formerly known as the California Yang Gang, is a nonpartisan, nonprofit dedicated to improving the quality of life for all Californians through advocacy, organizing, and promoting innovative solutions and bills such as this one. We're thrilled to have recently endorsed HR 2307, also known as the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, a landmark bill that will disincentivize further pollution on our already strained climate. Tonight's discussion, we are so pleased to have two guest experts to elucidate this bill. So now I'm going to pass off the mic to my colleague Sarah, who's going to talk further.
All right, thank you, Sean. Thank you everyone for attending. It's great to have you all here. And as you all probably know by now, the point of this policy night is to discuss in detail HR 2307, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, why we endorsed it, what the heck it means, what it entails, and maybe answer any questions that you have along the way. HR 2307, the EICDA, or the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, it's not the first time that it's been introduced to Congress. In fact, in the last Congress, it was known as HR 763, and it gained almost 90 co-sponsors from both sides of the aisle, or from all sides of the aisle. So it's a very bipartisan piece of legislation. Right now, it's only been introduced into the new Congress for a matter of months, and it already has 70 co-sponsors and counting. So that's fantastic news for this bipartisan piece of legislation. So the EICDA, this act, if and when signed into law, it'll implement a monthly fee on every ton of CO2 emitted by the fossil fuel industry. And that money that's collected by the government will then be redistributed to the American people in the form of a monthly dividend. So what exactly does that mean? Why is it a good thing? Why is this better than other solutions we've tried for climate change? And how can this potentially contribute to the fight towards economic and environmental justice? That's what the point is of tonight's policy night. So the people who are going to be diving into that tonight are Max Ghenis and Stuart Collins. Max Ghenis is the founder and a researcher at the UBI Center, which is a think tank dedicated to researching different UBI policies. And he's also an actively involved member of the Citizens Climate Lobby, which is a nonprofit, pretty much global organization that fights for, at this point in time, HR 2307, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. And we're also joined by Stuart Collins, who helps coordinate state-level Citizens Climate Lobby affairs, specifically in California. So thank you two so much for being here. Thanks to all of our audience members for calling in. And without further ado, I'll pass it off to Max and Stuart.
Great, yeah, great to be with you. Sarah said I'm Stuart Collins. I volunteer for a long time with Citizens Climate Lobby, and right now the capacity I do is I help coordinate actions for California. There's a lot of different chapters that are organized in local congressional districts, usually in the main city of those congressional districts, that work to lobby their local member of Congress. Max?
Yeah, it's awesome to be here, especially with Sarah and Sean and Stuart. As Sarah mentioned, I lead the UBI Center, which is a think tank that really our mission is to make UBI the world's most well-researched public policy. I think it's a really powerful policy concept that needs some more just quantitative research, and that's sort of the area we specialize in, figuring out what does different UBI policy entail depending on the design, tax policy, how it affects benefit policy. And I'm here today because mostly in this capacity with UBI Center, I think the carbon dividends model is probably one of maybe two centerpieces of the most likely paths toward a UBI. And that's because it's universal, it's funded, it's sustainable, and it meets some other it meets other goals. Obviously, a lot of people come from the environmental angle. I think there's this opportunity to come from the other angle, which is poverty alleviation and all the other reasons people care about UBI.
Yeah, absolutely. So I figured I'll start with an overview of what the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act HR 2307 is, which will kind of give us the foundation for the rest of our conversation. And then following that, we'll get into more of the nuances, because we think that this audience is into like, well, let's get into the wonky details. So to begin with, let me see if the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act is a carbon fee and dividend model bill. So what does that mean? Carbon fee, we put a fee on carbon, there's a carbon tax, and dividend. And then the income from that carbon tax is given out as a dividend to US households. Carbon fee and dividend, that's the model. Now, the benefits of the bill are that four big ones. First off, it leads to us getting to net zero by 2050. It's a key part of doing that. And it does, I have a bit about that, but it does a significant progress towards lowering carbon emissions in the US. And that's like the primary goal of the bill is like, let's lower our carbon emissions so that climate change is mitigated or averted to some amount. Next, so net zero by 2050, affordable clean energy. So this incentivizes the research and investments that lead to affordable clean energy that is reliable, that is affordable, and has a lot of support from state and federal governments. Next, it saves lives. So this, I guess it bears repeating. If you pollute less, fewer people get sick. And if you pollute less, people that are like living in really high pollution areas also get sick less. There might be other things we need to do to really do justice to those people that have been, living next to high pollution areas, and we should do those things. That's a kind of a other topic we'll get into in a bit. But this bill itself saves lives by lowering pollution across the US. And then lastly, it puts money in your pocket. So the dividend, every American household would be getting a dividend check. Exactly how that's done, it could be done a few different ways, but you could imagine you get a monthly or quarterly check in the mail from the IRS that is your carbon dividend from the carbon fee. And there are no restrictions on how you use that. You can use it however you see fit. And those are the four big benefits of this bill. And let me show you one thing, which is just to that main point of like the primary purpose is lower carbon emissions. Let me just show you kind of what we'd expect as far as carbon emissions reductions for the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. All right. So on this chart here, you can imagine we're starting in 2022, and this chart, the y-axis is percentage of 2010 net emissions. So we're already a bit below 2010. That's welcome, but it's not enough. And if business as usual were to go on, like if nothing were to change, we'd expect it to be, nothing would really change. Like it would be about the same emissions. Yeah, technology would advance, but some things would stay the same or increase, and more or less we'd have the same emissions. And that does not work because this is the range that the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, based on the research that they survey, is like, well, we need to lower our emissions inside this window if we want to have the world only warm on average 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, which is still a lot and will lead to a lot of discomfort, but at least, maybe not a total catastrophe. And the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act would be expected, based on the economic modeling we've done, bring us down inside that window. That's really great. So it's like with this act, you can do a significant, this is one action that the US federal government could do that would really make a difference. Is it the only thing we should do? Probably not. But without something of this magnitude, I don't know if anything else you do is really going to make the difference. So something like the carbon fee and dividend in the form of the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act can make a significant difference. And then lastly, one thing I would compare, sometimes we're like, well, what about other things we could try? Well, there's our Paris. The Clean Power Plan. So you remember the Clean Power Plan at the end of the Obama administration, which was a regulatory approach. So using the power of the executive branch and the agencies controlled by the executive branch, let's institute the Clean Power Plan, try to reduce our emissions from power generation. And that helped. But as you see, the expected reduction in emissions from that, a regulatory approach, weren't significant enough to really land us in what the IPCC expects would be needed to really be making the difference. So I say that just because regulations often are oversold as far as what kind of impact they'll have on real emissions. Not to say they should never be done, but they're not going to make the big difference that a carbon price really can. Okay.
Stuart,
I could just
Yes.
Oh, can I interrupt with a quick question? So
Yes,
this
Sarah.
fee, if I understand correctly, will be imposed on like the industries, right? The fossil fuel industry. What if they just like pay the price, they just like pay their fee, they pay their tax, and then they just keep going business as usual? Like, is there enough significant evidence to prove that a fee would in fact reduce the amount of CO2 that they emit, or will they just, like, if they're so rich already, they'll just pay it?
I have a response to that, but Max, do you want to step in at all about that?
Sure. I mean, so I think one thing is the chart that Stuart showed, that's very consistent across studies, like external researchers, economists agree pretty much across the entire spectrum of ideology. It's one of the most important, it's the most important things we can do to reduce emissions. Companies are in it to make a profit, right? If they're not making a profit anymore, they're not going to be in business. And that applies to fossil fuel companies too, especially when, as Stuart said, it's a way to get us toward more affordable, clean energy. So there's going to be competitors coming after those fossil fuel companies. They're going to be at an advantage because their costs will be lower from the carbon price. So I do think there's a lot of modeling that goes into these kinds of projections, and they do consider those kinds of things. One other thing I'd add too is that even supposing it doesn't make a difference, the nice thing about this bill is it's a dividend. So the absolute worst thing that could happen, I mean, it would be bad for the environment. And there are safeguards in the bill to avoid this, but we could just have a lot more money. Like fossil fuel companies would just give the people a lot more money. So it's kind of the reverse fossil fuel subsidy that we have today.
Yeah, that would be a wild future. I think it's really well said. Like, well, let's assume they didn't make any difference and it didn't change their fitness as a business. Well, they would be funding a dividend that would be going to all Americans. But really to business fitness, like if you impose a tax on something, people use less of it. Like that is one of the kind of rules of taxes. Like it's an income stream, but if you tax something, people will try to avoid that tax, usually by using less of the thing. I have another chart I want to show, and then I'll kind of speak to business plans specifically, because this chart is about like individuals, you could say. Oops, there it is. So this chart here, this is, the red line is youth smoking prevalence. So how many youth were smoking?
I think we're on the wrong,
Yeah.
seeing the wrong screen, Stuart.
Oh, I'm sharing the wrong screen? Oh, what a shame. Let me share my correct screen. There we go. Okay. All right. Thanks for that. Okay, so the red line is youth smoking prevalence. So how many young people had smoked? And the US tried lots of stuff. They tried putting really dire warnings on the packages. They tried putting them behind the register. They tried doing all sorts of things about like, let's reduce youth smoking. And nothing really made a huge difference until they started taxing cigarettes more. And when the price went up, smoking went down. Because when you tax a thing, people use less of it. And that was something that actually worked to reduce smoking among youth. Should it be the only thing you're doing? Probably not, but it is the thing that really makes a difference. Now, when it comes to businesses, they see the same thing. If something is more expensive to do, they're going to try to use less of it. And if they don't, then the businesses that aren't paying the tax because they're doing renewable energy, say, versus a fossil fuel energy, they're going to be making more profit, and due to that more profit, they're going to be able to attract more investment because investors see they're a profitable company, and they're going to be able to grow faster. That's the nature of investors in capitalism as well.
And I sort of touched on this before, but Stuart, could you talk about the way in which this bill adjusts the price to make sure that it's hitting the 2050 target?
Yeah. So one of the things that's important to this, we wanted the bill to be designed in a way that wouldn't shock the economy. Like if you're like, well, 1 year there was no carbon price, and then the next year was like $100 a ton, like that would be a big shock. And companies that had planned to build a facility that had a lifetime of 20 years, but they did it under the old pricing regime, now are kind of getting the rules changed on them, and that can really cause a lot of legitimate problems for them that are, you could argue are unfair. So the way that this starts is the fee per ton starts at a moderate level. $15 per ton, I believe, is the starting price. And then each year it goes up by $10 a ton. So $15 per ton the first year, $25 per ton of emissions the second year, $35 per ton the third year, and up and up and up. And so the price is predictably going up. And what does this lead to? Well, over time, the price signal is saying, get away from emissions, and companies respond to that. Also, it starts at a moderate level so that companies can adapt reasonably in the early years, and they know there's a lot of predictability. They know, like, oh, in 10 years, it's going to be such and such price. So when I plan my 20-year plant today, I'm actually going to factor that in because my plant needs to be profitable in 10 years too. So it changes how companies invest today because they can see the future of pricing. And that is how the pricing is designed in the bill. Yeah. All right. Does that kind of speak to what you're looking at there, Max, of like the step ups?
Yeah, I think there's another provision which is kind of interesting too, that if the emissions aren't falling enough to get us on the trajectory to net zero by 2050, the price even goes higher. So it's not just $10, it can go up by more than that. If the elasticity, as we say in economics, is lower than all the modelers suggest, there's still going to be that extra bump.
Yeah, exactly. I really like that. It's like what we have predicted, we expect to work, and if it doesn't, it's gonna ramp up till it does work. Like that's the idea. All right.
So, Stuart and Max, one question is, this bill's sounding really great. Why haven't we tried something similar in the past?
When you say we, do you mean the Americans or?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So politics is complicated, I guess is the shortest answer to that. So similar things have been tried around the world. Canada recently passed something quite similar to this mechanism. British Columbia, a province of Canada, has had it even further into the past. California, in collaboration with, I think, part of Canada before that, is in a cap and trade system. It's a different kind of carbon pricing system. So carbon pricing has been around, and carbon pricing attached to a dividend has been tried in like Canada and British Columbia. But why hasn't it been tried in America? Well, politics is complicated. So getting to agreement on a major bill, this would transform the direction of industry in the US, and it would also be this kind of just new idea of how to do taxation in the US, taxing carbon. Like that's just not been done before. I mean, maybe for hydrofluorant, hydrofluoric emissions before, but that was kind of a much smaller example. Carbon is like emitted in so many things that this is like across the entire economy. So I kind of chalk it up to like, it's big, it's new, like it hasn't been done before, and it uses the word climate change, and some people, a lot of the people up to now on the right side of the political spectrum have been like allergic to the word climate change. They kind of see it as like a virtue signaling against what they are aligned against. That's melting over time. And for the last 10, 12 years, climate change has kind of been like, ugh, to the Republicans. And again, that's melting over time, which we're happy to see. But without both parties supporting the bill or this kind of proposal, it's very difficult to pass something this big. And so there just hasn't been agreement from both parties. Now, we think we're on a path towards that. We're happy to talk more about that tonight, but that's kind of like, why hasn't it been tried before? Max, anything you want to say to that? Or Sean, you want to follow up on that?
That's good. Thanks, Stuart. Sarah's unmuted, I think.
I am unmuted. A quick question. I see we also have an audience question, but before we move on, you mentioned, I think, cap and trade. You mentioned like California and whatnot. Can you quickly define cap and trade and like talk about the significant differences between cap and trade and this carbon fee and dividend?
Yeah, let me see if I got any chart for that. So the core elements, they're both, so let's start off with what's similar between them. They're both ways to put a price on carbon. So you are running a power plant, or you're making concrete, you know, like a lot of these emit carbon. There's emissions, you're burning fuel, or you're one way or another, carbon dioxide is coming out of the emission stack. So putting a price on every ton of carbon that comes out is both those mechanisms aim to do. Okay, so a carbon fee, a carbon tax is, I think, easier to understand. So let's start there. We just declare a price for every ton of carbon that comes out of your smokestack. So like for every ton that comes out, and we can calculate it based on how much fuel you burned, the $15 per ton, and that's what you pay. It's, you know, pretty straightforward. Okay, a cap and trade system. So a cap and trade system says, you know what, I don't really like what a carbon tax does, because with a carbon tax, I know what people are going to pay, but I don't know how much is going to get emitted. Like maybe people pay a lot, but we end up with lots of emissions, but I need to have a guaranteed cap on how much emissions get emitted. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, in my country, or let's say California, in my state, there is a cap on how many emissions I will allow to happen in the state. Some like that, you know, probably million tons. I actually don't know what the cap is. And then I'm going to hold an auction, and all of the power plants and power generators and everybody else who emits carbon is going to come, and they're going to bid. They're going to actually, there's going to be an auction, and they're going to bid for permits to emit such and such amount of carbon, because they kind of know how much they're going to emit in the next year. And they auction it, and through that auction, they pay a certain price, and that is the price per ton of carbon. Now, the advantages or the attractivenesses of that is that you have a kind of predictable cap on how many emissions you're going to have in the state, but you don't have predictability in how much it's going to cost per ton of carbon. And you also don't know, like, well, maybe emissions were going to come down anyway, and permits end up being like penny stocks, like really, really cheap to buy. Maybe. I mean, you don't know. You don't know how much it's going to cost per ton. So those are the two systems. And California, what they passed was a cap and trade system. And the idea is maybe you lower the cap over time, and then the price of carbon kind of responds in accordance to that. Okay. So those are like the fundamentals of how they're mechanisms. But there's a catch. Cap and trade usually always has a, what if you bought some permits, but then during the year you accidentally went over your permitted limit? What happens? Usually you pay a penalty fee. So you're ending up paying a fee per ton of carbon anyway. So it kind of like reverts to a carbon fee system if you go past your permit limit. And one of the things that I am less attracted to a cap and trade system is because there's not predictability in how much the companies are going to pay per ton of carbon, it makes it very difficult for them to predict over the next 10 or 20 years what projects they should approve or not approve. It's just difficult to run a business when you don't know what your costs are going to be. And so because of that, a carbon fee, which is very transparent pricing, is attractive in that sense. Thank goodness for California having a carbon pricing system. Cap and trade is my second favorite system. Thumbs up to having it. My favorite is a carbon fee system, but cap and trade, like, I love that it exists.
I just add also that it's not super relevant because the price that's being discussed just for political reasons is usually a fair amount lower than this, but the estimates for how much a ton of carbon actually costs society, it's called the social cost of carbon, depends on the study, but if you take a global view, like when we emit a ton of carbon here, that's going to hurt people, especially in developing countries who really don't have the infrastructure to deal with it. You get something like $400 per ton is the social cost of carbon. So when we can set a price, we can set a target, and the Energy Innovation Act would get pretty close to that over time. With a cap and trade system, you can't really guarantee that the price is going to approximate the social cost of carbon, which is the economically efficient outcome that you want. It's also harder to predict what the dividend is going to be, which do you want to get into that now, Max? Like the dividend and kind of like its the connections to UBI and how that works? Yeah, sure. Or should we just? I know there was one audience question, so could you just take the border adjustment? Describe that real quick, Stuart.
Oh yeah, any major loopholes or issues tracking carbon use in other countries that have already implemented? Yeah, so this gets to something called the border adjustment or border carbon adjustment. Now, so where does this come from? Okay, so in your country you pass a carbon fee. Good for you. Well, what if another country, let's say Canada, nefarious Canada, didn't have a carbon price, and we passed a carbon price in the US, and then Canada was like, ha ha ha, they're going to be taxed there. We'll just build all the steel in Canada where we don't have to pay this tax, and then we'll ship it to the US, and we'll ship cheaper steel to the US, and we'll put their steel industry out of business because they have taxes there that we don't have to pay. So that's a concern, that if you pass a carbon fee domestically, you are disadvantaging your industries that now have to pay it, but maybe importers to your country don't need to pay it. So enter something called the border carbon adjustment or border adjustment, where when I import some good that's energy intensive, like steel or concrete or oil, that I'm going to refine or burn, when I import that, I add a tariff or a tax on it as it comes across my border that's equivalent to the emissions that it represents according to my tax, and I get to keep that tariff. So what this does is it means that my local companies are on an even playing field with foreign companies that are building similar products and commodities, but that's nice. But I think my favorite part about this is now it incentivizes these other countries to put their own domestic price on carbon, because the way the bill is written is when another country has its own domestic price on carbon and they're collecting that tax, I don't collect that border adjustment because there's no adjustment to be made, and that country gets to now keep the income that they're collecting with that tax. And this is a mechanism by which the entire world is incentivized to adopt their own local carbon pricing, and then it spreads around the world in that way. And we're starting to see this actually. So the European Union has a carbon pricing system, and they've had it for some time. It's been a cap and trade system. And they recently passed, I don't know when it happened, but in 2023, it's going to start being border adjusted. And already Russia and China are talking about it like, oh, we got to get our carbon tax or some kind of pricing in, because we want to keep that income domestically. We don't want to give it to the Europeans. So I mean, okay, great. Like if Russia and China start imposing a carbon tax, then I'm very happy about that. But that's the effect that a border adjustment has when a major economy does that. Andres, any major, do you have any follow-up to that? Any major loopholes or issues tracking carbon? Yeah, okay. Yeah, and maybe we can get into more of that later. But that's the mechanism that the border adjustment is.
Cool. Yeah, I'll move on. I'll share a couple slides and graphs. You know, this is the nerd night, so I'll respect the theme, just about the connection to UBI. So if anyone works at the Zoom, please tell them to improve this for Chromebooks. Let's see. Can you guys see it now?
Now it's showing your event.
Not quite.
Nope, we're showing your notes. Do you want me to show one of the slides from that deck?
Let me try once more.
I could. Okay. If not, yeah, I can show it if it doesn't work. That looks good.
Now it's working? Okay. I can't see you all, but yeah, so let me know if there are questions. So I think, one of the really important things to note here is, as Stuart was mentioning, this is just incredibly important, like the most important thing we can do for the environment, both domestically and abroad. It makes sure that we can hit our own domestic targets, including the targets Biden has set in the more near term and long term. IPCC wants us to do it. And also it encourages other countries to take more action through the border adjustment. It produces innovation that will have spillovers to other countries. So that's all, I think, really great, and we need a carbon price of some sort. I think the other thing to note here is that EICDA is the only feasible legislation in Congress for permanent universal monthly checks. So there are over 70 co-sponsors on this bill today. There's no other bill that is doing anything like that in Congress. So I knew he would make an announcement, so my cat is here. But I think
So glad you made an entrance.
So the dividend, it starts pretty small. So this is the expected, and because we know what the price is going to be, we know what the volume of carbon emissions is going to be, we can estimate how much the check per adult is going to be. And that's going to start at about $20 per adult per month. So this is every month. And over time, because the price grows over time, $10 a year, that's going to hit a peak of about $90 per month per adult. And kids get half a credit, is the way this works, by about 2034. And who knows, that might be a little bit off by a year or two or something like that. And then it's going to start to fall, because even though the carbon price is growing, the carbon emissions will fall faster than the price is growing. So that'll be sort of the peak. But I think if you think of, like, we'll have over 10 years where we have infrastructure. We've been paying every American every single month, including kids. And that's going to be a trajectory that I'm kind of skeptical people will let it just fall. Maybe there will be some other, who knows, maybe within 3 years, there could be another recession where we use that infrastructure to pay people so that they don't fall into poverty. Sort of the way we had a lot of difficulties during the pandemic, we can avoid that with this infrastructure. Or we just find some other revenue source to supplement this, to make it grow even faster, and to make sure that it continues growing and we continue fighting poverty and inequality the way that I think a lot of us know that UBI has the potential to do. So I think this puts us on a really solid path, or any sort of carbon dividend bill would put us on a path to build that infrastructure.
So here's a question regarding, the dividend. And I've gotten this question before, and I wasn't 100% sure how to ask it. So I thought I'd ask, or I wasn't sure how to answer it. So I thought I'd ask you. So to my knowledge, this dividend is Americans qualify for it. But what does that mean? Does that mean if you're a citizen? Does that mean if you're a permanent resident? Does that mean if you, etc., if you're working and paying taxes in America? So like exactly who qualifies?
Yeah, it's all permanent residents, so there's no citizenship requirement. And yeah, it's half a credit for kids. So it'll be $20 per adult, $10 per kid in first year, regardless of citizenship.
Great, thank you.
Cool.
Yeah.
So I think the other thing this demonstrates in I'm sorry, I found them right before
It's
this.
okay.
Anyway, yeah, so it does demonstrate how progressive UBI is as well. So this is a chart from an externally produced study known as the Household Impact Study within CCL that estimates for every income quintile what benefit do you get from the carbon dividend. So that's what's in green after taxes. And so this green number, this goes down with quintiles because it's actually a taxable transfer. So the dividend, you pay taxes on it, which means that higher income people pay more tax because of the progressive tax code. So basically every household on average in the first bottom quintile in that first year, they're going to get about $500. And about half of that is going to be eaten up by higher costs for energy directly, right? Because they're going to pay a little bit higher electricity costs, maybe higher heating, but also the goods and services that they buy that also pay for energy. Those will increase in price. So on a net basis, that's about $240 per year, or about $20 per month on a net basis that those households will get. So that's going to grow as well. This is just that first year. So within a decade, it's probably going to be closer to $100 per household per month. So that's actually a huge, that's definitely no $1,000 a month freedom dividend, but it is a pretty huge effect. We've done a lot of simulations of policies kind of like this, showing how much it reduces poverty, reduces inequality, especially when it does reach children. So, we haven't released this research yet, but I'll just say as one potential talking point, like this is a bigger poverty effect than a $15 minimum wage would be, it's even in that first year. So it's something else to consider, and that's just going to grow more and more over time.
Speaking of the freedom dividend, how does this compare to other cash programs or guaranteed income?
Yeah. So I do have a couple slides on this as well. Oh yeah, so I will mention it. Yeah, Andrew Yang did promote this policy in the presidential primary. Yeah, so if you can compare it to a few other kind of pieces of legislation or initiatives that the UBI community has talked about. So there is another carbon pricing bill that was recently proposed by Senator Whitehouse, and that's called Save Our Future Act. That would provide means-tested benefits every 6 months to households in the low and middle income groups. There's also the American Families Plan, CTC expansion. That's a huge initiative for us. And then, Andrew Yang, basic income, we have these guaranteed income pilots as well. But if you think about, okay, is it universal because it's including all ages? Is it means-tested or not? Is it lottery-based the way that guaranteed income pilots are? And is it monthly? This is the only legislation that fits all of those 4 boxes. And of course, these are all cash. So there's sort of 5 boxes within the UBI sphere. But the CTC expansion is means-tested. I think we're going to see how well that works starting next month, because they're trying to produce these monthly transfers based on a means-tested program. That's always challenging because you have to estimate people's eligibility based on their past income. And that is inevitably going to produce some people who are either overpaid or underpaid. So yeah, I think this universal approach really does help. One other thing
to that universal approach.
Oh, sorry, Stuart.
Yeah, could I say one thing about the last slide, that universal approach? So that top line, no income limit. So the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, as it's proposed now, there's no income limit. You don't like, at some income, you stop getting a dividend. No, I think just everybody gets the same dividend. It's taxable at different rates, as Max pointed out, but everybody's getting the same dividend. Why do we think that's important? Well, it's simple, but why do we think that's important? We think real carbon pricing that makes a difference is going to be, it's going to be disruptive to the economy. And by disruptive, I mean it's going to change stuff. There's always somebody who doesn't like change. So how are we going to have it be supported over time? This carbon pricing needs to be passed and then still be sustained over time. And when the Congress changes in 4 years or 8 years or 12 years, it doesn't get undone or taken apart. So, well, how do you do that? Well, we want to make it very popular. And one of the ways to do that is very transparent about like, what is the money being used for, and do it in a way that is attractive to a lot of different political tribes. And everybody gets the same check is a very attractive way. For example, I'd point you to the way Social Security works. So in this country today, assuming you paid a certain amount of taxable income over your lifetime, you get Social Security checks. And everybody gets them. There's not like mean tested in that way. They're taxable and different according to your tax bracket. And that is a very popular program that no politician is willing to touch because it's really strongly held by a lot of different political tribes. Like, we want to keep this. So by having it not be means tested, but instead be given to everybody, those kind of programs end up having a lot more sustainable support from the public, and thus sustainable support from politicians. So we think that is a strategic choice, and it's simple and easy to understand, which is like, always go for the simple and easy to understand option if you got a choice, right? That's what I wanted to put in about that, Max. If anything you want to add on.
You're speaking our language, Stuart, for sure, within the Yang Gang.
Oh, good.
Yeah, and I guess I would also point back to this. The top quintile, yes, they are getting the benefit, but they're paying a lot more. If you're concerned about like, are we giving money to the rich? Well, they're losing a fair amount on that basis, especially if you consider they consume more, they pay higher taxes on the dividend, and they also own parts of these corporations which are bearing the burden of the carbon tax. So, I think it's fine to make everyone better off, but in all likelihood, this is to some degree a redistribution from the rich to the poor as well.
Yeah.
One other thing I want to mention on comparing to other policies is it's actually a larger transfer than even like the child tax credit expansion, which is a huge important priority, I think, for the UBI community. That would be about $400 billion over the next 4 years. So this would start in 2022, go to 2025. And same thing with Energy Innovation Act, it would be $500 billion. You can compare that to if Andrew Yang had won and implemented his basic income plan. Condolences to the fans of his in the audience. That would have been $4 billion. The California Guaranteed Income Pilots, this is something Newsom proposed in his budget over 5 years. So this $7 million per year over 5 years. Stockton demonstration is $1.5 million. So Energy Innovation Act, one way to put it is this is 300,000 Stockton demonstrations. I don't think there's any way that that's going to happen. Like, the pilots can provide useful, maybe academic information or good PR, but they're not going to actually implement UBI nearly to the degree of a policy like this. And also, if you then consider that the Energy Innovation Act is going to go through 2050, it's going to distribute $6 trillion in current dollars, 2020 dollars. So $6 trillion over the next 30 years or so. And the child tax credit expansion expires in 2025, even if Biden's American Families Plan was signed into law. So this is just a huge amount of cash going directly to people every month, unconditionally, universally. sort of unparalleled compared to other policies. So I'll stop
Very
there.
cool. Very cool, very cool. All right.
All right, so there is another thing that I'd like for us to discuss. So Stuart, you were mentioning how it's so important if we want this carbon fee and dividend to be sustainable, we have to make it popular. And I'm sure everyone in the room right now knows that while like this bill, it's like popular-ish, like a lot of people don't really know about it, they're still learning about it, but there is one specific climate legislation that's very, very popular right now, and that is the Green New Deal. And a lot of people who I've spoken with take issue with this specific bill because they think it goes up against the Green New Deal, or they think it can't work in tandem or whatever. So could you two speak a little bit to like this versus the Green New Deal? Can they work in tandem? Are they even like complementary? Kind of what's the deal there?
Yes. Could you say more about that, Sarah? Or how about this? I'll ask Sarah, but also if anybody who's in the audience wants to respond to this question in chat, please do. Well, what do you hear as the like, when somebody brings that up, what do they say that like, what's the complaint? Like, this part of it isn't the Green New Deal, or what do they say?
So that's a good question. And I think that first and foremost, a lot of people who are, so I think a lot of people who are like more towards the Green New Deal and less towards the carbon fee want a more like a quicker, more hands-on, almost invasive way to like stop the fossil fuel industry. And they think that like a problem of this requires a like larger government intervention. And they see a carbon fee and dividend as having like less impact when it comes to good jobs, like infrastructure development. They see it as a smaller government like solution. Oh yeah, that's a good point, Tim. Some people think that the carbon fee is regressive. The DSA, I'm assuming you're talking about the Democratic Socialists of America, have made that statement. So it's kind of interesting because like, you know, conservative people maybe sometimes think that this is too big, and then like very progressive sometimes think that this is too small. So what are your thoughts on that?
Great. Okay, so we'll address what you brought up, and then I imagine there might be other Green New Deal related things. So ask them as we go through. And Tim, I got what you also wrote in there, which we'll get to as well. Could we do it faster some other way? We need to do something faster. This is not where. What is it about? So I'd say the first thing you want to do if you're talking to somebody who has a perspective like this is you need to understand where they're coming from. So you might have some great factoid. You might know some great statistics. It's not going to change anything if they don't get that you understand them and you know where they're coming from. So the fundamentals of like conversation and persuasion still apply. Understand who you're talking to, where they're coming from. Now, if somebody's like, but the government needs to just like take action now, or we need to take action now, and this isn't it. So if I were to ask them and I were to sense that, you know, what they're really uncomfortable with is they see this as more of the same, like, oh, this is just another market-based solution to try to fix something. And I've seen how the market has done over the last, market solutions have done over the last 30, 40, 50 years. It's like, it's led to where we are today. So why should I trust a market-based solution, market-based, like applying a tax and letting the market sort it out? Okay, so first off, I'd acknowledge some things in that is like, yeah, we have had that system and it's led to where we are today. And you know, I'm not happy with where we are today. This is an example of something that hasn't been priced. It has been free, or more or less free, to pollute and let somebody else deal with it. That $400 per ton of like social cost, somebody will breathe bad air, but I don't have to pay for it. Like there has been no cost associated with that. And that of course leads to bad behavior where people will pollute because they can make money on that, but they're not paying for it. Now we're attempting to fix that market failure. That was a failure of the market, first of all. And this is an attempt to fix that. But can't we do something that's not the market? Like, I don't trust any kind of market solutions. Like, well, what are you going to do? Like a regulation approach. The Clean Power Plan was the most recent kind of big regulation approach from the Obama administration. And it lowered emissions a bit, or was predicted to lower emissions a bit. But two problems. It wasn't ever predicted to lower emissions very much, and it got taken apart by the next administration as soon as they came in. So that's what regulation approaches are weak at. They're weak at sustaining over time, and they really don't change too much of emissions anyway, and they tend to be really complicated. You have to go after the power sector and the concrete sector and the steel sector, and that's really complicated, and you're using the government mechanisms you have available. What is that? Well, what if you're like, but I'm unhappy with the way government is set up today. The government should be able to just say things are different or change things. I don't like capitalism. I don't like that we have a capitalist society, and my main distrust is just with capitalism. If that's where they're at, my response to that is, maybe capitalism isn't, I personally like capitalism, but I really get that there's a lot of people who don't, and it really doesn't work for them. It hasn't worked for them up till now. Now, what if we as a society decide we want to change? We want to change how we do things so that we're not in a capitalist system that there is like markets like that. Well, okay, let's have that conversation. But I don't expect that to change in the next year or 5 years. And maybe if there's major transformation, a decade, maybe more than that. But it's like you're not going to have a functioning government that's operating on a completely new paradigm that's not capitalist next year. And we need to act on this now. Like, there is no waiting, and we need to, imperfect as they are, we need to use the systems that are available to us today, which is a capitalist society in a republic democracy. That's the tools we have today. It might be imperfect, but that's what we have to work with. And this is something that, if it were passed, would work in that system to make a significant difference in the emissions that get dropped. Let me pause there and let Max, if there's anything you want to add in, or Sarah, if there's any response that comes up.
Yeah, I just add, there has been, so Green New Deal is not a bill. I think the most important centerpiece of it is the job guarantee piece. That's by far the most expensive piece of the Green New Deal, providing everyone a guaranteed job that could be in the climate sector or something else, is just it's a major revamping of society that's, I think, very much at odds with the sort of more freedom oriented, like UBI empowers people to do what they want. A job guarantee does not really do that. So I think there's a non-climate focus, even if people are motivated by climate. There's never been a study either of how much the Green New Deal could reduce emissions. There have been ample, probably dozens, if not maybe hundreds of studies from scientists all over the world projecting that carbon prices reduce emissions substantially. So I think if someone's proposing not just a Green New Deal, but any sort of alternative to a carbon pricing model, show us the money, I guess. Show us the carbon emissions. How much is that plan going to reduce carbon emissions? Because this is too important to sort of speculate over. If we take over the government, if the government takes over the power sector and the auto sector and the steel sector and every other sector, which is what you need to do, we're going to cut emissions. I think it's too important for that. We need to actually go to the science.
Yeah,
that's a great point. And yeah, go for it.
Say that I see the Green New Deal and the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act as kind of, a fruit, like a grocery fruit section, and like apples. Like they're related, but they're also not like the same thing. The Green New Deal is like a set of principles, a set of like, we want to have these kind of policies in place. It's not, there is no House Resolution 3768, the Green New Deal. Like it isn't a piece of legislation. It is a intention to go after a family of legislation, and there's a lot
Yeah.
to commend about that. The Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act is a specific bill that can be voted on and passed or not passed in Congress.
Yeah.
And it does a significant job in one component of the Green New Deal, which is like, let's really control pollution and incentivize companies to start investing in green or invest in non-emitting jobs and industries.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
That's a great point. And in that sense, I actually misspoke. It's not a popular piece of legislation. It's a popular vision or resolution thing, piece of document.
Yeah.
And in a sense, I would
If
say,
you're talking to anybody, sorry, go ahead and
oh
finish.
no, I was just going to add that because it's not necessarily legislation, that's actually really important too. It's like, yes, we can all get behind a just future with great jobs and clean air, but one actionable way to do that is through carbon pricing, so I think that the fundamental difference of these two documents actually plays into it big time. So yes, you're completely right. Thank you for that.
Yeah. One takeaway I would have for anybody who's, if you're like, I think this sounds great, and you're talking to somebody who's really loves the Green New Deal, you want to avoid having it be an either or they're against each other. It's like, that's not my view. I think they go together well. So that's that. I think
But
we should
carbon
take
pricing is more important for actually solving
I
the
think
climate.
carbon.
Yeah.
I think
Great,
the
yeah.
necessary but not sufficient phrase applies here. It's like carbon pricing. If you want emissions to lower, carbon pricing is necessary, perhaps not sufficient. But if you don't have carbon pricing, you ain't going to hit your emissions targets. Good luck.
I think it is sufficient, is what the studies say also.
I guess that would be correct. It is necessary and sufficient, yes.
All right, thank you guys.
Yeah. Tim asked, I hear that carbon fee is regressive from the Democratic Socialists of America. Yes. So let's talk about this. So you put a carbon tax in place. Who pays for that? So it's a little misleading to say we're going to put a tax in place and the polluters will pay and all the people producing these big corporations, they'll pay. It's like, well, yes, that is true. The tax is applied way upstream, at the refinery, at the mine. But guess what those companies do? They're going to raise their prices on the goods they sell. And what that's going to do is it means that the carbon intensive goods in the economy are going to cost more than the low carbon intensive goods. And consumers are going to now have a choice, and they're going to start going towards the lower cost goods. And over time, the economy starts to favor lower carbon intensive goods. Okay. But initially, it's like, well, I own a truck. I can't just start putting electricity into it. I need to buy gas. So your carbon taxes increase the cost of gas for me, and I'm not going to change my truck out this year. So that increased the costs to the end consumers. So just regular Americans, whatever that means to you. Every American will be paying higher costs because you either pay for gas or you buy groceries and the delivery truck that brought the groceries runs on gas. There's costs will find you somehow. So to what Tim brought up, I hear the carbon fee is regressive from the Democratic Socialists of America. Yes. So who, as a percentage of their income, will pay the biggest rise in costs? The lowest income people. So the lowest income people in America, as a percentage of their income, will see the biggest rise in costs that go to them as a percentage of their income. And so in that sense, if you just passed a carbon tax and left it at that, it would be regressive. The lowest income would see a rise as a percentage of their expenses compared to the higher income group. So when you add in the dividend, and the dividend is the same dividend amount, not a percentage of your income, just the same absolute amount across everybody, then it turns into a progressive bill, because now the lower income people, as a percentage of their income, are getting a bigger benefit that outweighs the increased costs they had. So carbon fee on its own, yes, it's regressive. A carbon fee with a dividend, progressive. Nice change.
And actually, even the carbon fee it sort of depends on the study. I've seen some studies that show it's closer to flat as a share of your income. I think this does raise a more general point about UBI. Oh yeah, I was just Rick took the words out of my mouth. VAT, for example, is also a bit regressive. So, but if you look at the difference between the US and other developed countries, we're the only one that doesn't have a VAT. We don't have a consumption tax. And this explains basically the entire difference in the share of GDP that we collect as taxes compared to European countries. So I think DSA folks, they want a more European style welfare state. Just if you were to go off of history and compare to other countries, that would mean that we do need more of these regressive taxes or flat-ish taxes, because there's just not enough revenue to raise if you were just going to do, let's say, wealth taxes from the very top. Bernie Sanders' wealth tax was the most aggressive that's been proposed. That would raise under $3 trillion over a decade. That's about half of what this bill would raise. Oh, sorry, that's not true. This is over a longer period. But over a decade, a VAT would raise, I think something like, it depends on the rate, but it could be 10 times that much. If you had like a 15% VAT or 20% VAT. And when you put that revenue back into the benefits, like UBI or any other kind of welfare program, you're going to make the net result much more progressive. So we're going to reduce inequality by having these more broad-based taxes that fund more generous benefits. And I'll actually drop a link in the chat because we've done some research showing how even flatter taxes, when they're distributed as UBI, can really change the game in terms of inequality.
Yeah. Dana asked a question. Dana, what's the status of the bill now? Given how partisan Congress is partisan, do you expect it to be passed soon? So the status, and I'll answer your follow-up question first. Would an executive order from the president help? So an executive order from the president would not help this because the president does not have the power to levy taxes. So taxes like this need to be passed through Congress. The president could do executive orders that use the executive branch's different departments to perhaps restrict this or that emissions, but they could do something, but they couldn't change. The Biden administration couldn't change the tax system. So it needs to go through Congress to be this. Okay, so what's the status of the bill now? It has been introduced in Congress and it has 71 co-sponsors. So a little bit about CCL, my organization. Citizens Climate Lobby is organized in the way that we have local chapters. Think like 5 to 25 active people in a given district, maybe more, and those people meet with their member of Congress and kind of build support locally for the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. And they literally meet with their member of Congress. They call them up and they're like, hey, can we meet with you in June? And they go and they meet with them and they ask them, will you support this bill? And over time, we have met with just about every member of the Congress. That's like 450 some people in the House of Representatives, 100 senators. And we meet with them every year, a few times a year, often. And what we're doing is we're building support for the bill across Congress with that. The current state is 71 co-sponsors, mostly Democrats. Actually, I think this is all Democrats right now. Yeah, the last version of the bill in the last Congress from 2019 to 2020 had one Republican co-sponsor when it was first introduced, but it didn't attract Republicans after that. And so we have a lot of support from the Democratic side, and we're working away at the Republican side. We're working with them for a long time. Now, Republicans have come a long way. So 10 years ago, they were like, climate change, thank you for meeting with me. I'll listen to you, but climate change isn't happening. There's that. And then 6 years ago, it was like, well, maybe climate change is happening, but I don't know if we could do anything about it. And then it's like, well, climate change is happening, but I don't know what I'm going to get done or I could stand for in this climate. So Republicans have been moving in the direction we want them to, from kind of like extreme denying that it's happening to, it's like the stages of grief. Like, this isn't happening. it is happening, but I can't do anything about it, to like, it is happening, I could do something about it, but I can't, to we're about to get to like, okay, I can do something about it. And we've seen Republican proposals this year to do something about climate change. None of them are anywhere near sufficient, but they're actually acknowledging that climate change is happening and they should do something about it, and that it's politically important for them to do that. That's huge. So they're moving in that direction. Are they in the place yet where they're going to vote for the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act? We'll see. Amazing things happen. Now, the bill, it's sometimes called a bipartisan bill, and that is true in the sense of the bill is designed to attract Republican support, because it doesn't expand the size of government, because the income from the carbon fee is just sent out to Americans again as a dividend. It's not expanding the size of government. Traditional Republican economic theory really is attracted to that. That said, we don't have Republican co-sponsors right now. Let's just say that. And we're working always away on like, get closer, get to the table. We're going to get left behind as a country if we don't pass something. China and Russia are looking at passing this. The EU is going to put a border adjustment on us. Do we really want to be laggards here? Do we need to be competitive? So we're going to Republicans with messages we know really are designed to work with Republicans. So way back to your question, given how partisan it is, do you expect it to be passed? I don't expect it to be passed tomorrow. I wouldn't put it past possibility that it gets passed in this Congress. By that, I mean like by the end of 2022. But there's a lot of changes in the road that'll happen over the next 2 years and how politics evolve. Republicans know that the young people in their caucus tend to be more pro do something about climate. And it's a crisis for them if they're not holding on to their young people. And they know that, so they're kind of in a pickle, and they're looking for a way to make it to come out on one of these bills. And we hope it's this one. Max, anything you want to add on to that I missed or otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole group I think it's a pretty vibrant group of young conservative students for carbon dividends specifically. So I think among the conservatives who are younger, who care about climate change, this is a very appealing legislative option. And there's a Chamber of Commerce has endorsed it. I mean, there is, I think, a big opportunity right now because of the infrastructure package. So the American Jobs Plan does not have a carbon price, but I don't know, I guess my Twitter feed is curated for this kind of stuff, but I definitely see rumblings of people who are in Congress, who want it to be part of it. And I don't think that door has shut yet. So it's a good time.
Yeah. Let's see. If you're curious about the Republican climate plan, by the way, I just put the link in the chat. Okay. Sarah, do you have other questions you want us to follow, or should we just go with anything that's coming up in the chat?
See, I wanted to mention one was, sorry, I think I've removed this from. Yeah, one thing I wanted to ask was, sort of on the global scale, what the progression is on carbon taxes. You mentioned a border adjustment and how that would encourage other countries to establish a carbon tax. I believe that the EU is in the process of establishing one as well. So sort of what other countries, how many other countries either have a carbon tax or on the way to one? Is there an anticipation of, when and how this would become a globally accepted legislation?
Yeah, so Max, do you have a response? I've been talking.
I mean, my understanding is that most developed countries have some sort of carbon pricing mechanism. As you said, cap and trade.
34 out of 36.
Okay, who's our bestie with that one?
India.
Do you know?
India.
Okay. Yeah. So. Yeah, we are laggards. I mean, it's bad. You talk about market economy, and we have a market economy that has probably the biggest distortion, biggest fossil fuel subsidy which is the absence of carbon pricing. We do not have a free market that internalizes externalities, which is required to have a functional market. So we are really alone in not having combated this problem in sort of what used to be, and this sort of gets back to the DSA thing. Back in 2016, Bernie Sanders was seen as kind of a radical for having a carbon dividend plan. He had one with Senator Feinstein, or Senator Boxer, I think, maybe, from California. And Hillary Clinton wanted more of the regulatory approach because carbon pricing was seen as too far left. And now things have reshuffled. But I think the reality has not changed, which is this is the most ambitious, most progressive, I think, approach to the serious problem of climate change that other countries that skew more liberal than us tend to adopt.
If we were not to enact this bill, would we begin to face penalties from existing border adjustments?
I don't know of an existing border adjustment. I don't think there's any existing border adjustment, but yeah, we would start paying that adjustment when we're exporting into Europe in 2023.
I see.
That's when the border adjustment comes into effect. Yeah.
And I think we have Donna actually stole the question right out of my mouth, was, what's the role with the Paris Climate Agreement in this deal?
Actually, can I rewind real quick to the border adjustment? I think one other piece here is that Biden, via John Kerry, who's the special envoy for climate change to the UN, I think is his formal job right now. Apparently, Biden is considering a border adjustment without the carbon tax. So basically just a tariff on countries that don't have high standards or a carbon pricing kind of scheme, even though we don't have one here. And my understanding is that this is probably in violation of the World Trade Organization rules. In addition to being, I don't know, I think questionably, it seems kind of weirdly almost immoral to charge things for other countries not doing something that you're also not doing. It doesn't really demonstrate leadership, in my opinion. So.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. To the Paris Agreement question, what's the Paris Agreement's role in this deal? So the Paris Agreement was, I'm going to summarize something some of you probably know this even in more detail than I do, but a group of countries come together, and the meeting was in Paris. We called it the Paris Agreement, and they agree we are going to have these goals of reducing emissions over time. And that's really laudable, and it takes quite a bit. Well, those aren't binding. Like, I don't actually, and maybe I'm getting out of my depth here. I don't know what's binding about the Paris Agreement. Now, we left the Paris Agreement, under Trump. I don't know what that effectively legally changed, besides it was like in the news, and it was virtue signaling from Trump. Now, one of the big impacts of the Paris Agreement is domestically in all those countries, people like myself or possibly you could go to our representatives and be like, we made an agreement that we would reduce this, but we haven't been doing anything about it. You really need to pay attention to this proposal. You need to take this seriously, doing this. It gave a lot of ins for people who are advocating for carbon pricing or any other means that reduce emissions to get airtime and pressure their elected representatives to do something about it. So in that way, it was important. And the Paris Agreement gets talked about a lot. Like, you and I know about the words, the Paris Agreement, and that it's like, we're not meeting it. That is relevant, even if it doesn't have legal relevance. It's relevant as far as like getting the message out and the moral justification of what we need to be doing and are not doing. Max, anything you want to add on to that? Or if I misspoke?
No, yeah, I think that's my understanding as well.
Yeah. Let's see here if there's other things I wanted to cover. So one thing, I have some other details about the Energy Innovation Carbon Dividend Act that I find useful to know, interesting to know. But before I I choose. I would love to hear from you if there's things that you particularly want to know about in more detail. Especially if you're like, I think this sounds great, but how can I talk to my friend over there about it who will have this concern? Like, you could ask about that. Or if there's anything left over for you that you're concerned about, or things you want to know more about the benefits of. I'd love to hear from you before I just pick something. All right, well, go ahead and put that in the chat if you got it. Let me see if I got one here. So one thing that, going back to the Green New Deal and creating jobs, does the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act create jobs? I would say yes, but it doesn't do it directly. It's like there's not a part in the bill which is like, and there will be 100,000 jobs paid for with this part of the bill. Like that's not part of the bill. But creating jobs, we have found the American economy has been an incredible success in some measures on the world stage over the last decades. It's just performed really well. What our greatest strength, perhaps, I don't know if our greatest strength, but like a big strength of the US in our global influence nowadays is the strength of our companies. Of the huge major companies that are valued like over $1 trillion, guess where their home bases are? They tend to be in the US. So we've had a lot of our influence on the world is through the way our market leads to companies that are doing innovative, big work. There's also some problems when it comes to antitrust, but that's a whole different subject that's being addressed. But the market that the US has led to a really strong set of companies that are very influential. So how does the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act create jobs? Well, if you change the balance of the market, if you say like, hey, it now costs more to emit a lot of carbon and less to not emit carbon, companies are going to see that. There's going to be some entrepreneur, maybe named Max down there, who's going to be like, oh, big opportunity, people, let's go. And he's going to be like, I'm going to go really fast. I'm going to start a company that is now creating jobs installing solar panels. That's kind of the obvious one, but maybe there's creating jobs building charging stations. You know, there's stuff that is now makes sense to do and you can make a profit on that you couldn't before because there wasn't this price differential between emitting a lot of carbon and not emitting carbon. And entrepreneurs in the US, it's easy to start a company and go after that opportunity. And when they go after that opportunity and they're successful, they're going to attract investment and then they're going to employ a bunch of people. Like that is how the US employs people. Its system is set up for companies to get successful and employ people. Is our country fair? And should the rules about how the market treats employees be like altered and changed and improved? Yeah, I think so. That's a separate topic though. One of the big strengths of employing people in the US is if you enable companies that go after an opportunity, they will go after it and they will create jobs in the process. And that's what we see. That's what we would expect from the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act once you change the incentives of pricing.
Yeah, I think also just to add, in terms of jobs are kind of a weird metric as an outcome because to some degree the Fed controls employment, right? They can adjust interest rates. That's going to trade off inflation compared to employment. So I think given what makes it easier to have more employment is if you have a strong economy. And there are a number of studies showing that carbon pricing, especially in the long term, but even in the short to medium term, when you count GDP correctly, to, for example, account for the fact that people die less when you have carbon pricing because there's less air pollution, that's lost work hours, lost productivity for the economy. And in the long term, we're going to have all these fewer natural disasters, even just like high temperatures make it really hard to grow crops. Some of the CCL's biggest supporters have been like breweries and people who are in the agricultural sector because they know that this affects their business completely directly. So if we want a stronger economy in the long term, we need to cut our carbon emissions. If we want to save lives and also grow the economy in the short term, we need to price carbon, same thing. And all of those are going to produce not just more jobs, which is kind of like just the number of jobs is really a Fed outcome, but the jobs are going to be better because our economy is better. We're all going to be richer as a result. And the distribution of those riches are going to be more equitable because of the dividend.
Great, thank you guys. So 2 more questions before we close out the event for the night. The first one was in the chat actually. So can one of the co-sponsors of this bill bring it to the floor and have it voted on at some point in Congress? Or do you guys know kind of how that works?
Yeah, so the way Congress is designed, it's designed to go slow. And so the way a bill works is it gets introduced and it has some member of the House that sponsors it, and they might have some people that come along with them and introduce it all together. And then other people can co-sponsor it. That's just a declaration of support. When a bill is first introduced, it's assigned to one of the various committees in Congress. And those committees usually have some smaller number of representatives, like, I don't know the size of all the committees, like think a dozen or so people. And that committee reviews the bill, revises the bill, and maybe kills the bill. Maybe they're like, you know what, we're not gonna pass this bill on because the bill needs to go through committee, get revised, and then brought out to the whole House, the whole Congress to be voted on. So bills need to pass through a number of different stages to actually get to the point where Congress votes on them. And right now this bill is in, I believe it's in committee. So it's like, it's been assigned to committee. I don't know what's been picked up. And committees are kind of this black box. Like you don't always know what's going on there. And it's helpful to have the head of the committee be your ally. Because if the head of the committee doesn't like you or is from the other party and doesn't like your bill, they can use certain maneuvers to like, kill off the bill. Okay, so if it passes through committee and then gets voted on, then it needs to get sent to the Senate, and then the Senate needs to vote on it. Maybe they revise it and pass that, and then if they revise it, it needs to go back to the House of Representatives, and then it goes to the president. So there's a lot of different stages, and we're in that early stage, the committee stage. Yeah.
Which is probably a good time to advertise CCL. I'll take off my UBI Center hat for a second and just say that, CCL is probably one of the most, it's definitely the most organized advocacy grassroots group I've ever been a part of. There are people all over the country leading chapters to really make sure that every member of Congress is getting that pressure to say there are people in your community and your district who want carbon pricing, want carbon dividend, and there's all these levers of will, levers of political action that people specialize in, whether that's connecting to the media or leaders in the local community, not just members of Congress, but faith leaders, business leaders, et cetera, or just reaching out in a grassroots way, lobbying Congress. So lots of internal tools if you're interested in developing your skills as an advocate for public policy and learning from people who really care about the nuts and bolts and trying to find the policy that's going to make the biggest impact for society. I think this is just an incredible group of hundreds of thousands of people, or tens of thousands at least, I think, very active volunteers. So yeah. And the more calls Congress gets from folks like you, the more likely they are to sign on to the bill.
Yeah, and the thing I'd add on to that is my mind went blank right at the key moment. Citizens Climate Lobby is a group that, as you said, is pretty well organized. We didn't really talk much about Citizens Climate Lobby and how it does what it does. In this time, we talked about the proposal, the policy. But a lot of what makes CCL attractive for the people that participate with CCL is the way it's organized and the way it really empowers local chapters to do what they judge to be best in their local district. For an idea of, if you were to volunteer with CCL, what does that even mean? It might mean a variety of things. It might mean I make a call to my congressperson once a month and I get some emails from CCL, all the way up to like, I help run the local chapter. Or anything in between. There's a lot of ways to be a volunteer with CCL. And most people are volunteers, are not staff, so don't expect to get paid. But it's great.
Yeah, And I can say firsthand, I think probably everybody on this screen right now who's pinned has been to DC to lobby for this bill. And it's been, I mean, it's an experience as a volunteer. If you want hands-on federal, like legislative experience, CCL is a great way to get that experience. So I just want to close off this event in the last minute or so and profusely thank our speakers for the night, Max and Stuart. Thank you so much for your time this evening. Thank you for answering all of our questions. And for everybody who attended, thank you for giving us your time as well. Also, we're walking away with a couple of action items tonight. One, look up your nearest local CCL chapter, get involved, attend their next chapter meeting, see if you vibe with the folks. And two, we haven't talked about this before, but I'm going to drop a link in the chat. It's for an incredible climate. It's a simulation tool. So you can play around with it and see just how effective carbon pricing actually is. And this was just a non-affiliated, non-partisan think tank, I think at MIT, right? It's called En-ROADS. It's a great simulation. I highly encourage you all to check it out. And last but not least, we'll have policy nerd nights in the future regarding climate, but also regarding other interesting US policy. So make sure to, stay in the loop on Slack, join our Policy Nerd Night Slack channel, check us out online, levelupcalifornia.org. We'll be having an interesting policy nerd night next month on prison reform and several in the series after that on criminal justice in general. So stay in the loop. And again, thank you to everyone who attended. Sean, if you have anything else to add, please.
Here's our Slack link if you ever want to join. And be sure to stay in touch. Sarah already mentioned we have a criminal justice reform event coming up soon. And if you have ideas for events or there are bills out there, groups that are doing great work, such as the Climate Change Lobby or Citizens Climate Lobby, feel free to send it along to us. So without further ado, thank you, everyone, especially our speakers.
All right.
Thank you,
everybody. Appreciate it. Have a great rest of your night.